Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the latest in our Invisible Histories talk. And we're very pleased to welcome Ian Bullock from Brighton. So that's somewhere where it would have been a complicated process to get you up to Salford, Ian. So we're very pleased that we're able to do this virtually. And Ian is going to talk to us about his new book, The Drums of Armageddon, which focuses on how the outbreak of World War I was covered in the three main socialist weeklies. That's Clarion, Labour Leader and Justice. And as I always say, our events are free. If, however, you feel able to donate to the library, we'd be delighted. And there's a donate button on our website, and my colleague will put that in the chat.
Okay, well, hello everyone. It's great that so many people have joined in today. What I'm doing is I'm introducing my new book. I'll do which you see on the screen. I'll do a brief outline of the book, and then I'm going to read three extracts which include substantial quotes from my three sources, or two of the three sources. I borrowed the title, by the way, from a Clarion article by Blachford that appeared 3 days after the war was declared. In previous books, I've always used the socialist press a great deal as a source because it's always seemed to me the best way of finding out what organisations and their members really thought in readers' letters as much as in articles and editorials, and what their priorities were. But Drums, as I'll call it for convenience, is different in that it's entirely based on the three longest established weekly papers of the British left in 1914. Justice, the Clarion and Labour Leader. Can I have the next slide, please, Lynette? Right. You'll see that this is a front page of Justice from somewhat later on, from as you can see from the headline. The Justice began in January 1884 as the organ of the Democratic Federation, which later that year became the first modern socialist organisation in Britain, the Social Democratic Federation, or SDF. By 1914, it was the paper of the British Socialist Party, or BSP, which had been formed in 1911. It would have been considered at the time the furthest to the left of the three papers. Next slide, please. Yeah, the Clarion started in 1891 as an independent paper edited by Robert Blachford, the most effective socialist propagandist of the period, whose Merry England of 1893 sold over 2 million copies worldwide. And to quote the Wikipedia entry, I quote, "It was said that for every one convert to socialism made by Karl Marx's Das Kapital, there were 100 converts made by Merry England. And though even this may be an underestimate," it seems to be the Manchester Guardian of the time who said that. The Clarion movement was quite large. The Cycling Club had nearly 100 reports from local sections in the issue of the 3rd of July, 1914. And there were also theatrical groups, camera clubs, choirs, swimming clubs, clubs for ramblers, and the Cinderella clubs that organised outings and treats for underprivileged kids. The third weekly was the Independent Labour Party's, or ILP's, Labour Leader. Next slide, please. Thanks, Lynette. This began as Keir Hardie's own paper back in 1894. It was from the first regarded as the mouthpiece of the ILP and in 1904, Hardy sold it to the party. In 1914, it was edited by Fenner Brockway, who is, incidentally, the only person in the book that I've ever met, if only very briefly. Between them, they covered most of the spectrum of the British left in 1914, especially as regards attitude towards the war when it broke out. Labour leader was resolutely opposed to British participation in the war, and before the end of the year, it would be promoting the No Conscription Fellowship with its editor, the Labour leader editor, Fenner Brockway, as secretary of that organisation. The Union of Democratic Control, or UDC, which campaigned against secret diplomacy and for a fair and just peace settlement at the end of the war, was another organisation very much promoted by the paper by the end of 1914. I think we can dispense for the moment with any slides, Lynette, if that's all right. By contrast, I mentioned the Clarion. By contrast, the Clarion, though deploring the horror of the war, came out for it as a tragic necessity, and in the second wartime week carried the famous Kitchener appeal ending in "God Save the King," a God, by the way, that Blachford didn't believe in, having written 2 books rejecting religion completely in the early years of the century, a God who was now urged to save a monarch for whom Blachford had never shown much support. The position of justice was less clear. It was the weekly paper of the BSP, but it was also under the control of people, virtually all men, who usually referred to themselves as the old guard of the SDF, who very reluctantly accepted British participation in the war in support of Belgium and France and opposing the German invasion of those countries. By the end of 1914, it was clear that the opponents of the war, who were usually younger folk who called themselves internationalists, were likely to be in the majority of the BSP. And the BSP split in 1916, with the majority eventually forming most of the initial cohort of the British Communist Party, while the old guard of the revived SDF became the most vehemently uncompromising opponents of the Bolsheviks and communism on the left in the UK. They were unequivocal in their insistence that there could be no socialism without democracy. I've tried, as always, to present these views as impartially as I can. My main thought about 1914 is, thank goodness I wasn't around then to decide what on earth to do. Unlike my previous books, Drums covers only 6 months, the second half of 1914, beginning with the final peacetime month of July, and then following the outbreak of war on the 4th of August, it continues through to the end of December. And I've deliberately written it for the non-specialists with copious footnotes to help those who are unfamiliar or out of touch with the relevant history of the time, or perhaps long forgotten. Of course, people who don't need them can skip them. Another way in which it's unlike what I've done before is that I've published it myself. I did try to find a conventional publisher and only resorted to self-publishing because of my age. I'm 79. I just felt that I haven't got time to hang around waiting for an acceptance. Besides, I'm not too far off finishing another book on the old guard of the SDF. And I have an idea for what I might write after that. One very welcome thing about Drums is that it costs us a paperback less than half what any other book of mine or that I've been associated with does. The Kindle version costs even less. The main drawback is that it's available at the moment mainly via Amazon, though you can also get it from Waterstones. I'm very sorry about Amazon, but there's really no alternative currently. I think we could lose the slide if that's all right, Lynette, because thanks. The first two chapters of the book deal with what preoccupied the three papers during the last peacetime July, the last one until what, 1919. It was not the threat of war, which is what one would expect now, but all sorts of other things, including temperance, which was due to be debated at the ill-fated Congress of the Socialist International, which was scheduled to take place in Vienna that August, but of course didn't. Chapter 2 deals with the most pressing issues in Britain as they were seen at the time. Industrial militancy had eased a bit since 1912, but there was a massive struggle with the trade unions of the so-called Triple Alliance, which was named after the diplomatic Triple Alliance of Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. The Trade Union Alliance combined the Miners' Federation of Great Britain, the new National Union of Railwaymen, and the Transport Workers. Major strike action seemed inevitable come the autumn. Some were looking forward to this eagerly. Another big movement at the time, of course, was the militant suffragette movement. The arson campaign was still at its height. There was an attempt, which was reported in all of the papers, to burn down the cottage where Robert Burns had been born. The woman charged with this turned out to be a relation of Lord Kitchener, whose King and Country poster would soon be familiar to everyone. This second chapter also features an extraordinarily modern sounding feminist article, well, I think so anyway, and the reaction to it. It's by the young Ellen Wilkinson. In 1914, she was an organizer for the constitutional, as they were always described, suffragists of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, who greatly outnumbered the militant suffragettes. They had about 100,000 members to the suffragettes' 2,000. This article of Ellen Wilkinson will be the subject of the first extract that I'm going to read. The threat of civil war in Ireland overshadowed any threats from either the unions or the suffragettes. Both the UVF and the Irish nationalists were smuggling guns into that country. In both cases, they were guns from Germany, ironically enough. The Conservative Party was accused, quite seriously, of treason. It was encouraging armed resistance of the Ulster Protestants to the Liberals' proposed Home Rule. The Liberal government was dismissed by all three of the papers that we're concerned with as spineless and incompetent when faced with this threat. Then we arrive, so that's the first two chapters. Then we arrive at the actual outbreak of war, which I show was totally unexpected, even by the BSP's Heinemann and the Clarion's Blachford, who had spent the last few years warning about what they called the German menace. The first wartime edition of the Clarion's front page featured a piece by Hilda Thompson, who regularly wrote the theatrical reviews for the paper, and in July had written about trials of suffragettes accused of arson, which are described in one of the early chapters. The headline was "A Spoilt Holiday." She and a friend had left for a month's walking tour of the Harz Mountains on the 30th July. Arriving in Hanover on the 31st, they found people excitedly reading leaflets announcing the Kaiser's mobilization of the army. Still undeterred, they continued on to Hildesheim, where on Saturday the 1st of August, 3 days before war was declared, as far as Britain was concerned, they were advised by their landlord, who was, she reported, quote, under marching orders himself, to return home immediately, which they did. Of their attitude at the start of their spoiled holiday, Hilda wrote, quote, there were rumours of war, as everyone knew, but no one in England had taken the matter seriously. And we felt that the excitement would add to the pleasure of our trip. Amazing when you think about it, I think that. In the same issue, Blachford reported that on the weekend before the outbreak of war, more people among those he met in Sussex seemed interested in the coming regatta at Rye. There are chapters in the book on the attitudes to the unwelcome ally, Tsarist Russia, the most reactionary and tyrannical of the great powers, and the unwanted enemy, Germany, whose SDP was by far the largest socialist party in the world and had achieved a majority in the Reichstag in 1912. There's a chapter on the horrors of war, including the destruction of Louvain in Belgium, and in the final chapter, a vivid and horrific eyewitness account of the results of the shelling of Scarborough and other East Coast ports by the German Navy just before Christmas, which will be the subject of my final extract. The one in between, the second extract, something that really took me by surprise, will be an attack on racist army officers by Blachford. Although the term racist not having been coined, he actually called them snobs. Finally, before I turn to the extracts, let me say I was also surprised by the degree of agreement there was across the left on most of the other important issues, in spite of the overarching conflict between attitudes for and against participation in the war. Everyone on the left was agreed that servicemen should be properly paid and their dependents properly looked after, even those who opposed the war. They were all agreed that there should be no more secret diplomacy, which was blamed largely for the bringing about the war, and that the peace settlement, when it came, should not be vindictive towards Germany and must be absolutely fair and just. It was already being discussed by, among others, the UDC, whose leading members featured both Labour MPs like Ramsay Macdonald and Liberal MPs who would come over to Labour after the war's end. Most poignantly, for those of us who took part in People's Votes demonstrations last year, virtually everyone across the left agreed, whatever their view about whether or not Britain should be in the war, that the best way to avoid another conflict was to set up what they all called the United States of Europe. Okay, I'm now going to put my glasses on and turn to the first extract, which is from July. It's from the 2nd of July in Labour Leader. And the headline was Woman's Share of Socialism, a challenging article from a feminist. This was the headline in the 2nd of July. Ellen Wilkinson had, since graduating at University of Manchester, can we have an Ellen Wilkinson slide, please, Lynette? She'd been working as an organiser for the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. She made her mark by helping to stage the suffrage pilgrimage, culminating in the 50,000 strong rally in London, almost exactly 1 year previously. Later, she would become a national figure as Labour MP for Jarrow and one of the leaders of the famous Jarrow Crusade, which this slide illustrates. After serving in a more junior capacity in Churchill's wartime coalition, she would die in office as Minister of Education in 1947. She would be the only the second woman in Britain, after Margaret Bomfield, to become a cabinet minister. The July 1914 article was preceded by an editorial note saying that the paper endorsed most, but not all, of her criticisms. Quote, "We print her article because it represents a point of view which all men will do well to face." End of quote. Wilkinson's concerns were much wider than the suffrage issue. She believed that even the most revolutionary syndicalist versions of the new society were built, quote, "to suit men's prejudices." Moreover, quote, "the practical bricklayers are worse than the theoretical architects." There'd only been 3 women delegates to the last TUC, while the ILP conference had 20 women delegates, of whom only 3 spoke. The Labour Party had 12. She went on, quote, in how many cases is one woman desperately trying to hammer in the fact that men's comfortable assumption that women will fit into things as they've always done, i.e. do the dirty work and then take a back seat when matters of governance and interest are forward, that's based on the old dispensation of dependent womanhood and will not do now. When a young woman, fully convinced by practical experience that she's equal to her brother, wants to know what socialism is going to do for her, the only thinker to have got beyond the glorious helpmate of man's state is H.G. Wells, and he, with the honesty that is his finest characteristic, can only say, "It remains to be worked out." The final paragraph of the article ended with this plea: the idea that woman is only an undeveloped man, and that if given a fair chance, she will proceed along his lines, is so widespread because women have largely been content to let men do their thinking for them. What the socialist movement badly needs is a steady determination among its women to set aside for a while the masculine point of view, and by facing the facts that make them different from men, think out what they really want from the socialist state. The subsequent, that's the end of the quotation. The subsequent readers' letters this article generated showed considerable interest, both supportive and hostile, for the remainder of the month. Then, at the end of, after considerable numbers of letters, Wilkinson returned to the pages of Labour Leader with a letter. She said that she wasn't intending to suggest that, quote, that we should all indulge in an orgy of prophesying as to the clothes we should wear and the work we should do in the approved Edward Bellamy style, a reference, of course, to the American Socialists book that actually inspired William Morris to reply with News from Nowhere. My whole contention is that the position of the position of women in the general plan has not been thought out, is being ignored at the present time. No one knows what to do or what they want to do with the mass of unskilled, discontented woman labour which is on the market at the present time. No one knows what to do with the admittedly overworked mother of the working class house. When someone like Prometheus, who was one of her critics on the letter page, blandly folds his arms and gazing heavenwards talks about the queen of the home, the modern girl who has seen these queens drudging after children and husband dare not trust herself to speak. Excellent stuff, I think. I would be interested to see what other people think about that. I'm moving on now to Blachford on British Army officers. By this time, this is now in October. The war is well underway. Blachford has gone. Sorry, yeah. I missed saying having the other Helen Wilkinson thing. So perhaps we could just go back a bit and you know, just show them for a little bit longer. I'm sorry about that. Blachford had gone to France to report the war, and on the 16th of October, his article on the Clarion front page. Can we have the Clarion front page now? You'll see that this is the exact article: British snobs and Indian princes, things I have seen in France. After the war, after an army captain he met in France told him that he knew that Blachford disliked the captain's class, but insisted, "We're not all blackguards." He was at a loss to know, he said, why he was presumed to be so hostile. He had, Blachford insisted, always liked and respected British officers. But their one great fault was snobbery. Quote, "They are splendid chaps, but snobs." He then gave an example of this. Arriving at a hotel 5 miles south of Paris, Blachford was told, quote, with some pride by the hotel staff, that they had an Indian prince staying there who had come, quote, "come to fight for the empire." That evening at dinner, he and a friend were able to observe from a nearby table the prince came in with a British general who managed not to speak to him or even look at him throughout the meal. The following evening, he saw a group of British officers ignore him in the smoke room. Blachford's unidentified, quote, young friend thought that he had never seen anything so caddish and brutal in his life. And Blachford agreed. Quote, "He had come all the way from India at his own expense to fight our battles, and he was subjected to the most horrible snub by the officers of the army of the king to whom he was so strangely loyal." Unquote. Blachford's army officer was not, the captain was not present. Quote, "He had gone to the front. Had he been there, he would have joined in the infliction of that bitter insult on a brave man." This struck a chord with justice. On the 23rd of October, much of the topical tattle, which was a regular column in Justice, was devoted to Blachford's article. Quote, "Whatever some of us may have thought of certain aspects of our friend Robert Blachford on the European war, we can all agree that he has done excellent service by calling attention to the manner in which English officers behave to Indian princes." The paper's critical chronicle, which is another feature of Justice, was equally supportive. Quote, "Robert Blachford has done much good service for many years, but we doubt if he ever did a better bit of work for his own country and humanity at large than by his exposure in last week's Clarion of the incredibly caddish behaviour of English officers and gentlemen." The paper thought that the prince's action in coming to fight was, quote, "very foolish of him," but the officer's rudeness, or as we would see it now, racism, was inexcusable. Quote, how silly from the imperial point of view, as well as how blackguardly. That's my second extract. I'm now moving on to the third and final one, which is about, this was actually, is in the final chapter, which is about what happened in December. On 16th of December, German battleships bombarded the east coast towns of Scarborough, Hartlepool, West Hartlepool and Whitby. There were nearly 600 casualties, mostly civilians, including 137 fatalities. An eyewitness account by Thomas Beckett, headed Bloody Murder, appeared in the Clarion with terrible irony on Christmas Day. He began by referring to the reassuring statements made by the Admiralty about the, quote, entire absence of panic. But what did they know? We others know, by God we do, he continued. We poor civilians who are so brave and whose murder is to be regretted, we have no trenches or dugouts in which to seek shelter. And he then went on to give the following graphic narrative. I saw the man hurrying along the street, holding a girl by the arm. She was bespattered with blood from head to foot. The man was holding her arm to stop the gush of blood. I saw a thing on a flat cart driven at a gallop. It had a blood-stained mass where the head should be. I picked up a shrieking woman. She had seen her 16-year-old boy shattered by a shell. He went on. Yes, our demeanour was everything to be desired. It was. The self-sacrificing way in which helpless civilians assisted each other stands forever as a crushing reply to the mutant law of self-preservation. Here, a poor mother with 5 naked children flying before the murder. And here, people turning back to get clothes for these poor naked bodies and to comfort the demented mother. And all the while, the very atmosphere rocking with blood dry of hellhounds let loose. Okay. Thanks for you've anticipated me. Put up some nice slides of the shelling of Scarborough. So, I mean, that's it. I'm very happy to answer any questions or take part in any discussion. Over to you, Lynette.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Ian. And if people would like to join in a virtual round of applause, those of you who found that applause button on the reactions thing, or thumbs ups or whatever, yes, thank you very much. There you go, Ian. You get virtual thank yous from all.
Right, thank you very much.
47 of us now, so that's great. Now, what we've done so far, which has worked fine, is use the chat function in the main for any questions or comments. So if you can find the chat button at the bottom of my screen, and if you want to put in a question there, I'll read it out and Ian can respond to it. If you really don't fancy that, you can try giving me a wave, but I will. All right, good. Here's one to start us off with, so that's good. Thank you, Jeremy. Did any of the papers pick up on the Quakers' opposition to the war, Ian?
Yeah, Labour Leader did, particularly. I mean, they of course were opposed to, came out very adamantly opposed to the war, and there were things like there's one. I've mentioned one instance, for example, where Ramsay Macdonald addressed a Quaker meeting in, if I remember rightly, Manchester. So yes, it was mentioned, and it was. I mean, it was input from the ILP's point of view. It was very important because in the early 1920s, as I've mentioned in my book Under Siege on the interwar ILP, the ILP in the early 1920s got quite a lot of financial support from Quakers.
Thank you. Georgina says, thank you very much. The newspaper articles you read out are very powerful. It feels authentically from the horse's mouth. And from Steve, did Blachford give any indication of seeking an interview with the Indian prince?
No, he didn't.
Okay, that's an easy one.
I mean, he may have. I mean, he may have done, but if so, he didn't write about that. No.
So from Sue, do you think the war contributed to the increase of socialism in later years?
No. It's an imponderable one, that isn't it? Because so much changed in the over the course of the war, and one of the things that struck me was how things, if you look at what the three papers were writing about in July, how those things get pushed, at least temporarily, onto a back burner. So, it's very, very difficult to to answer a question like that. I think an honest answer is, well, it's anyone's guess.
Okay, I'm going to. Oh, hang on a minute. We've got a few comments there, which everyone can read. But a particular question: what did Adam Wilkinson do during the war years?
I just don't know. I didn't follow that up because I'm just trying to. I haven't written about the ILP in that period. I've written about it in the interwar period, and I've written about it in the pre-war period, but not during the war. So I'm not sure. I think she was I think she opposed the war. I think she was in the ILP. She certainly joined the CP, which suggests that she was an opponent of the war early on, and then of course she left and joined the Labour Party instead, and eventually became an MP.
There's a page on Adam Wilkinson in the activist section on our website, so I can't click to it at the minute, but we could certainly have a look on there. Once the library's back open, we've got some fantastic resources about Ellen Wilkinson, and a lot of things that she wrote as well in plebs and elsewhere. So we have Victor from Canada. Is it possible to gauge the influence of these papers on government views or military morale?
I don't think it. I think it. I mean, it's difficult. Oh dear. I doubt if any of them had any very direct effect on the government. I mean, if they did, I can't put a finger on that one. I'm sorry, Victor.
Or on military morale?
Military morale. Well, there's an interesting bit where one of the things that is interesting is the way that I mean, this isn't in the book, but the way that in January 1915, just after the book ends, but not, of course, the war. The way the famous Christmas truce was covered, it was given a lot of exposure in Labour Leader, and you get the feeling that it was taken as, well, you know, maybe this is the way forward. Maybe we can get bring the war to an end. Justice's coverage of it was not in any way hostile. It said, you know, it was great that there'd been this truce, but it didn't signify. It didn't mean that the war was coming to an end, and you know, it was just a pleasant, rather poignant sort of occurrence. So, you know, there's that sort. I think one has to conclude that of the two judgments there, that justice probably got it right. Unfortunately, it was a great shame that you know, the more optimistic view of Labour Leader didn't prevail.
A follow-up question from Victor is, how have other historians taken these views into account?
I don't know. No, I'm sorry. I'll have to pass on that one.
Okay.
You wouldn't think that I'd persuaded him to join in there.
Yeah, you're not feeding him up there.
Questions, not fair.
Do you know whether or not any of the three newspapers were read in the trenches?
No, I don't. Probably not, I would think, but who knows?
Would you accept David Swift's view that Labour patriotism was a major factor in allowing the movement to survive and grow?
Ah, now that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because of in those days there were no constituency Labour parties, so if you were a rank and file sort of supporter of Labour, you were usually in the ILP, and the ILP was very much against the war. And what happened at the end of the war in 1918 is that there was what became known as the khaki election, just a few weeks after the end of the war, in which most of the ILP Labour candidates, including Ramsay Macdonald and Philip Snowden, were defeated and replaced, usually in most cases, by Conservatives. But on the other hand, by 1924, Macdonald is leading a minority Labour government, having got back into Parliament in 1922. So, you know, it's difficult to measure these things in terms of, you know, things do change in that period a lot.
Did any of the papers report on socialist activity in opposition to the war in other countries, and later the Zimmerwald conference in 19...
Oh yeah, yes, all of them. That comes later, because the Zimmerwald meeting was in 1915, I think. But there's nothing directly about that in the book. But yes, there was a lot of coverage before the war broke out about big demonstrations, particularly in Germany and particularly in Berlin. In fact, you know, peace demonstrations, in which, you know, thousands or hundreds of thousands of people participated. So there was a lot of coverage in all three papers in different ways of opposition to the war elsewhere than in Britain.
Okay, thank you. Do you know if Robert Blachford spoke out any more about snobbery racism, as we would say?
No, I don't. But it's I just thought it was an interesting example of you know, early opposition to what, as I say, we would call racism. He called it snobbery. You know, I mean, the fact that the Clarion, they put it on the front page of the Clarion, I think gives and the fact that it was taken up by Justice, who commented so favourably on it, does indicate something, you know. But whether he I mean, I just don't know. I've not read the Clarion beyond the end of 1914. So I just don't know whether later in the war or after the war or whatever I can't think of any examples of attacks on what we would call racism before the war started by Blachford, or indeed many by anyone else. Although, you know, it wasn't unknown, but it wasn't as clearly labelled as it is today.
How did the papers cover the hostility and, in some cases, physical attacks which many of the opponents of the war faced?
Well, that's interesting, because I've got there's a section on a bit on this in if I can find it, which this is, it's difficult to know who to believe and what's 129. Yeah, I'll just read a bit, which I think, you know, I hope will answer the question, or at least contribute to and answer the question. For all on the left, whether anti or pro the war, they were all unanimous in declaring that they had no time for jingoism or the kind of and of course, you know, not even those who supported the war thought of themselves as jingos, although they were sometimes accused by their opponents of being that. There was a report in 14th of August in the Clarion about one of the Clarion vans. They went in, these were caravans where toured the country with people giving propaganda speeches. This is a quote from the paper. At Walworth we enjoyed jingo interruptions, it said. Things were even worse with the William Morris van, where, quote, at West Ham, we had to make a strategic retreat before massacres. This is a reference to, you know, the maffacking thing back in the Boer War days, who threatened the van. I mean, that of course suggests some misunderstanding initially of where the Clarion stood on the war, because they actually, you know, were the most supportive of Britain's participation in the conflict. Previous day, Labour leaders' review of the week had advised that, quote, protest meetings will at the moment serve to arouse jingo feeling rather than suppress it. But in the same issue, it had declared, quote, there is no war fever in Glasgow, except in the columns of the jingo press. But the situation appeared to be very different in not so distant Edinburgh. Reports from localities in the same issue included one about a peace meeting in the Scottish capital, organised before the outbreak of war, but which took place on the day following the British declaration. It was a large meeting with 2 speakers' platforms, and then the next bit is I've quoted. The chairman had barely begun when a steady flow of interruptions commenced, which gradually developed into cheering for the army and jeers and groans for the Kaiser and the socialists who wanted peace. Later, a speaker was knocked off one of the platforms. A report of this Edinburgh meeting the same day in Justice insisted that the disorder had been subject to gross exaggeration by the jingo press. While in Glasgow, it confirmed that, like the leader, that there had been, quote, no enthusiasm whatsoever shown for the war. A week later, on the 20th of August, the Labour leaders' weekly review insisted, quote, there is still no popular enthusiasm for the war. For all over the country, we received reports denoting an entire absence of jingoism. The people regard the conflict not as a holy crusade, but as a hellish calamity. I think that gives us a good idea of how it was viewed, yeah?
It sort of ties in with another question as well, I think. Did the papers show a growing realisation that it would all not be over by Christmas?
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I don't think any of them thought I think the notion that it was generally thought that the war would be over by Christmas is a bit of a myth. I'm sure there were some people who said that, but I don't think many people in 1914 believed that. On the, more likely that they couldn't see any sort of end to the war with modern weaponry and so on, that it would just go on forever.
Okay, why didn't you use the Daily Herald as a source? Asks Gordon.
I didn't use the Daily Herald for 2 reasons. One, it was a daily paper rather than a weekly, when I wanted to compare like with like. And taking the 3 papers that I took gave me, one sort of support of the war, one opponent of the Clarion, one opponent of the war, Labour leader, and one in equivocal position, which was Justice. So that fitted quite nicely. But the main reason was that the Daily Herald was a new. I wanted to look at papers that were well established. The Daily Herald was still fairly new; it had only been started the year before. And the same is true of the New Statesman, which was going at the time. So I just wanted to use the 3 longest established weekly papers.
Okay.
I mean, which is not. I mean, I'm not knocking the Daily Herald. It's just that's why I didn't use it.
Right, well, thank you very much to Mark, who's given us some more information about Ellen Wilkinson, which is there in the chat. I can send you that afterwards, Ian. So we've all had that.
Yeah.
Is there anybody else? I'm just looking at gallery view in case anyone wants to wave at me to ask a question. I am trying to scroll through you. Nobody is waving at me. So, oh, hang on, well, there's something just come through there from Martin. All right, okay, it's quite a long question. What struck me from a reading of the socialist press was the rapidity with which the ILP in particular adapted to the reality of the war, moving quickly from a position of outright opposition to a more pragmatic position, focusing on improving the everyday life of working people, which paid off in the long run in terms of ultimately increased membership. Would you agree?
Well, I don't think it was quite as clear cut as that, I've not followed through after. I've not followed through what the Labour leader and the ILP generally did after December 1914. So I can't really speak with any kind of authority on anything that happened subsequently. But at the beginning of the period, I mean, they were quite clearly opposed British participation. In fact, I mean, the paper was accused by its opponents of being pro-German. So I think that some people in the ILP had a more pragmatic view. One, of course, was the guy who became Prime Minister after 1945, who was Attlee, I mean, he joined the army as soon as the war broke out, ended up as a major, and was known throughout the, much to his distaste, he was known throughout the interwar period as Major Attlee, which was, of course, what happened to people in those days. I mean, his brother, of course, was a conscientious objector. So, yeah, there was no kind of unanimity. I mean, what is impressive on that one is the way that which I've described in in Under Siege, my book on the interwar ILP, the way that he, as somebody who'd fought and been badly wounded, in fact, in the war, actually, for a short while, collaborated very closely with who am I thinking of? Clifford Allen, who had been one of the leading conscientious objectors, and that they in 1921-22 they were collaborating together on what was called the Attlee-Allen proposals for the program of the ILP. So there was, I mean, that illustrates the way that you know, people could come together, I think, and perhaps it says something about, you know, the pragmatic approach of the ILP, but certainly at the beginning of the war, the emphasis was all on being opposing the war, and as I said, there was some, you know, quite a lot of criticism of this from people who didn't share that view.
Thanks to those of you joining in the chat with more information, much appreciated. Another question from your friend Victor, brace yourself. Based on your knowledge of the ILP in its post-war years, would you say its opposition to the war was held against it in political debates or public arguments?
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, clearly, to begin with, it was, because the people who the Labour MPs who succeeded in the 1918 election were not people who were associated with the ILP. I mean, people who were, I mean, the SDF people got various candidates elected, and the people who lost out, the people who were defeated, and of course, Macdonald, the first time he tried to get back into Parliament, he was defeated again in a by-election. It took him 2 goes to get back. So, you know, initially there was a lot of opposition, which you've got to put down. You've got to accept that was, rightly or wrongly, that was based on a disagreement or distaste for the ILP's presumed sort of pacifist position, or opposition to the war position. But of course, things changed by you know, by the mid 1920s. A lot of people who perhaps had thought that the war was a necessary, if evil, thing, were now beginning to think it was just a tragic waste of time, where millions of people had been killed and had achieved nothing worth the sacrifice. So that, you know, at that point, the Labour Party, in which, you know, the ILP was very much still a leading element, begins to sort of pick up a lot of support. Whereas earlier it had been, you know, the people who were associated with the war who'd succeeded in elections and by-elections, and the people who were opponents of the war, particularly the people in the ILP like Macdonald, Snowden, and so on. Hardy, of course, had died in 1915, so he wasn't around anymore. They were people who initially didn't do very well, but they came back later.
Okay, we have maybe one last question here, I think, maybe from Mark, which is: did Sylvia Pankhurst or Mary Barber's opposition to war feature in the papers?
Of course, I've written about Sylvia Pankhurst opposition to the war, and I have on just up the stairs from where I'm sitting, I have a large poster about a meeting which became known in the local press as the anti-patriotic meeting, which Sylvia Pankhurst was the main speaker in 1917, when after in February or March, depending on which calendar you use, the Russian Revolution broke out. So Sylvia Pankhurst does get a mention in the Drums of Armageddon, but not once the war. I don't think I mentioned her once the war started. It didn't pick up anything at that stage from that you know, seemed important to report. But I mean, she was certainly an important opponent of the war, and I mean, what's caused her to be in 1917? What caused her to be sort of outrage the local press here in Brighton was when she said that people had attacked the strike wave that was going on, in saying that it was denying men at the front ammunition and weaponry. And she said something along the lines of, I don't care who, the fewer weapons and less ammunition, the better. It means fewer people killed, fewer men killed. I don't care who they are, whether they're German or British. They're all human beings. They're all members of the human race. They're all our brothers. So yeah, she was a very fierce opponent of the war.
Okay, well, I think we've covered a lot there, and as I say, thanks very much to everyone who's also added in information as well as asking questions. I think we'd like to say thank you again very much indeed to Ian for having come on and shared with us, and do look for the book Drums of Armageddon, as he says, self-published but available from bookshops, not necessarily the one that everybody might use online. So yeah, thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. And next week, we have the next in our Invisible History series. And we are very glad to welcome back to the library, even if it's a virtual library, Jeff Brown, who's a good friend of the library, and others who are going to be looking back at the Northern Carnival against the Nazis, which was in 1978 in Alexandra Park in Manchester. So there'll be more information about that on our website. And this talk has been recorded and will be uploaded shortly onto our YouTube channel. So if you missed the start or you want to share it with anyone, that's how you best can do that. So that's youtube.com/WCM Library. And a reminder again that our talks are free, but if you do wish to give us a donation, there's a link in the chat feature now. So thank you very much in advance if you feel able to do that. So as I always say, thank you very much and goodbye until the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity from all at the Working Class Movement Library in Salford.
And thank you very much, everyone.